Picture this. You're deep in the wilderness, miles from civilization, and the only sound breaking the night silence is the gentle babbling of a creek beside your tent. But when morning comes, you count the sleeping bags around the dying embers of last night's fire and realize there's one too many. An extra figure sitting perfectly still in the dawn mist. Someone who definitely wasn't there when you all went to sleep. How long had they been watching you in the darkness? What did they want? And more terrifying still, why did they choose to reveal themselves only now, when you're trapped with nowhere to run? The smell of damp earth and smoke fills your nostrils as your heart pounds, knowing that whatever happens next will change everything about how you see those peaceful camping trips you once loved. This is exactly what happened to a group of experienced hikers who thought they'd found the perfect spot beside Silent Creek, a remote location known for its tranquil waters and stunning mountain views. But what started as a dream adventure quickly spiraled into a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They'd been hiking for 3 days straight through dense forest trails, their boots crunching on fallen leaves and pine needles, when they finally discovered this idyllic clearing where the creek curved gently through moss-covered rocks, creating natural pools that reflected the setting sun like liquid gold. Everything seemed perfect as they set up their tents, gathered firewood, and shared stories around the crackling flames, completely unaware that they weren't alone, that something or someone had been following them since they'd entered these ancient woods, waiting for the right moment to make their presence known. The terror that unfolded that morning would teach them that some places in nature aren't meant for humans, that certain creeks run silent for reasons we're better off not knowing. And if you want to hear more spine-chilling stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to Fearway right now. The first to notice was Marcus, the group's unofficial leader who'd been awake since 4:30 that morning, unable to shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. And as he stepped out of his tent to relieve himself, the sight of that extra figure made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The stranger sat cross-legged beside the smoldering fire pit, wearing what appeared to be old hiking gear from decades past, faded and weathered, like it had been exposed to countless seasons in these woods. Their face obscured by long, matted hair that hung like a curtain over their features. Marcus stood frozen, his breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air as he tried to process what he was seeing, counting the tents again and again, matching them to his friends still sleeping inside. Sarah and Tom in the blue tent, Jake in the green one, Emma in her solo shelter, which meant this sixth person had appeared from nowhere. The stranger didn't move, didn't acknowledge Marcus's presence, just sat there with an unnatural stillness that made every instinct scream danger. And when Marcus finally found his voice to whisper, "Who are you?" the figure slowly turned its head toward him, revealing eyes that reflected the dim light like a nocturnal animal's. Without warning, the strangers stood up in one fluid motion, their movements wrong somehow, too smooth, too practiced, like they'd performed this exact sequence 1,000 times before, and began walking toward the creek with measured steps that made no sound on the rocky ground. Marcus's shout woke the others, who stumbled out of their tents in confusion, their faces shifting from sleepy annoyance to stark terror as they saw the figure gliding toward the water. And Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm so hard her nails drew blood through his jacket. The stranger reached the creek's edge and stopped, standing perfectly still again as the water flowed around their boots, which seemed to sink slightly into the muddy bank as if the earth itself was trying to reclaim them. And then they spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through dead trees. "You shouldn't have come here. Not during the watching season, not when the creek runs backward at midnight. Jake, always the skeptic, tried to rationalize what they were seeing, suggesting maybe it was another hiker playing a prank. But his theory died in his throat when the stranger turned fully to face them, revealing clothing that wasn't just old, but somehow wrong. Seams in places that didn't make sense. Fabrics that seemed to shift and change in the growing daylight. Emma noticed it first. The way the stranger's reflection in the creek didn't match their movements. Always a second behind or ahead. Like two different beings occupying the same space, and she began backing toward the trail they'd come from yesterday, whispering urgently that they needed to leave immediately. Tom tried to reach for his phone to record what they were seeing, but his hands shook so violently he dropped it into the dirt. And when he bent to retrieve it, the stranger's head snapped toward him with an audible crack that echoed across the clearing, making everyone freeze in place. The watching season began 3 nights ago. The figure continued, their voice carrying despite barely moving their lips. When you cross the old boundary markers, the ones your maps don't show anymore, and every step you took deeper into these woods was witnessed by those who never left. The morning sun climbed higher, but brought no warmth, and Sarah noticed with growing horror that their breath was still visible, forming thick clouds in air that should have been warming, as if the temperature around the stranger refused to rise above freezing. Marcus tried to take charge, ordering everyone to pack up immediately. But the stranger laughed, a sound like water gurgling through a clogged drain, and said, "You can leave, but you'll carry the mark now, the scent of this place that draws us to you wherever you go." Because Silent Creek doesn't just flow through these mountains, it flows through time itself. Emma's backpack was already on her shoulders when she noticed something that made her stomach drop. Their car keys, which Marcus had secured in the front pocket of his pack last night, were now arranged in a neat line on a flat rock beside the creek, and none of them had heard anyone go through their belongings. The stranger began walking upstream, their movements becoming more unnatural with each step, joints bending at impossible angles, and where their feet touched the water. The creek seemed to flow backward for just a moment, creating small whirlpools that spun counterclockwise against nature's laws. Jake finally found his courage and demanded answers, shouting after the figure about who they were and what they wanted. But the stranger paused, only to turn their head completely around, while their body remained facing forward, a sight so wrong that Tom vomited into the bushes while Sarah screamed. "I'm the first of many," the stranger said, gesturing toward the forest where the shadows between the trees suddenly seemed to move independently. "We've been waiting here since the logging camp massacre of 1887, bound to this creek by blood and betrayal, and you've given us permission to follow by drinking from our waters last night." The horrible realization struck them all simultaneously as they remembered filling their water bottles from the creek, boiling it over their fire, making coffee with it this very morning. And Marcus felt his stomach churn, knowing they'd literally invited this thing into their bodies. The stranger was now knee-deep in the creek, still walking upstream, and with each step they seemed to fade slightly, becoming translucent like morning mist. But before disappearing completely, they pointed at the group and spoke one final time. "Check your photos from yesterday. Look closely at the backgrounds, and you'll see we've been with you all along, waiting in every shadow, reflected in every pool of water, counting down until the watching season when we could finally make contact." Emma pulled out her camera with trembling fingers, scrolling through yesterday's seemingly innocent hiking photos. And there, in image after image, were faces in the trees, figures standing just outside the frame, and multiple shadows where there should have been only one. Evidence that their entire journey had been observed by things that weren't quite human anymore. The group stood paralyzed as the implications of the stranger's words sank in. And Sarah was the first to break, sobbing uncontrollably as she zoomed in on a photo of herself by the creek, where a pale hand could be seen emerging from the water behind her, fingers reaching toward her back. Marcus ordered everyone to leave immediately, abandoning their expensive camping gear. But as they rushed toward the trail, they discovered that the path they'd followed for 3 days had vanished, replaced by dense undergrowth that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades, as if the forest itself had swallowed their only way out. Tom's GPS showed their location as blank space, not even registering the mountains that towered around them. And their phones had no signal despite showing full bars just hours earlier, leaving them trapped in a pocket of wilderness that seemed to exist outside normal reality. The creek's babbling grew louder, taking on a rhythmic quality like whispered conversations, and Jake swore he could hear his own name being repeated in the water's flow, beckoning him to come closer, to look deeper into the pools where shadows swirled without any source. Emma noticed their reflections in the creek were wrong, showing them as they appeared now, but surrounded by dozens of other figures, all wearing clothing from different eras, all with the same hollow eyes as the stranger who just vanished upstream. The sun climbed to noon position, but cast shadows pointing in multiple directions, and the temperature continued dropping until ice began forming on the edges of the creek despite the summer season, creating crystalline patterns that looked disturbingly like screaming faces. Sarah pulled out her journal to document what was happening. But the pages from the previous days were blank, except for a single line repeated over and over in handwriting she didn't recognize. The creek remembers everything. The creek forgets nothing. The creek runs through all times at once. Marcus tried to follow the creek downstream, reasoning it must lead somewhere. But after walking for what felt like hours, they found themselves back at their campsite, their abandoned tents now covered in moss and lichen, as if they'd been there for years, decades even. The forest grew darker despite the sun still being high. And Tom noticed that the trees themselves seemed to be leaning inward, their branches forming a canopy so thick that only thin beams of light penetrated, creating a cathedral of shadows around Silent Creek. Jake discovered his own driver's license in a rusted tin box half buried by the creek bank, dated 40 years in the future, showing him aged and weathered, with an address in a town none of them had heard of, suggesting their fate was already written somewhere in time's twisted flow. Emma felt something cold touch her ankle and looked down to see the creek water had risen impossibly fast, now swirling around their legs with an intelligence and purpose, pulling them gently but insistently toward the deeper pools where the stranger had disappeared. And in that moment, they all understood with terrible clarity that Silent Creek wasn't just a place, but a threshold, a crossing point between the world they knew and something far older and hungrier that had been feeding on lost hikers for over a century, adding their stories to its eternal flow. And they were about to become the newest chapters in its dark collection. The water continued rising with unnatural speed, reaching their waists in seconds, its icy touch burning their skin like frozen needles. And Sarah screamed as she felt something solid brush against her leg beneath the murky surface, something that moved with deliberate purpose rather than random current. Marcus grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her toward higher ground. But the creek seemed to defy physics, flowing uphill to follow them, creating impossible waterfalls that ran backward. and in the churning foam, they could see faces forming and dissolving, hundreds of them, all wearing expressions of terminal horror, frozen at the moment of their drowning. Tom's compass spun wildly before shattering in his hand, the glass cutting deep into his palm. And his blood dripped into the creek, where it didn't disperse, but instead formed perfect crimson circles that floated on the surface, pulsing like heartbeats before being absorbed into the water with a sound like satisfied swallowing. Jake pointed upstream where more figures had appeared, standing motionless in the water, at least 20 of them now, all different ages and eras, but sharing that same terrible stillness. Their clothes dripping endlessly without ever drying, their eyes reflecting not light but darkness, as if they were windows into the void beneath the creek bed. Emma realized with growing dread that their own reflections in the water were beginning to separate from their movements, lagging behind by seconds, then minutes, until their water selves stood completely still while they continued to struggle. And she understood that the creek was slowly claiming their souls, pulling their essence into its eternal flow, drop by drop. The temperature plummeted so suddenly that their breath became visible, forming clouds that didn't dissipate, but hung in the air like frozen ghosts. And ice began spreading across the creek's surface in patterns that spelled out names, dates, and fragments of last words from those who'd come before them. Sarah found a waterlogged journal wedged between two rocks, its pages somehow still legible despite being submerged, filled with entries from different hands spanning 2 centuries, all describing the same horror, the same realization that Silent Creek existed in a fold of reality where time meant nothing, and escape was an illusion maintained only until the water decided to reveal the truth. Marcus noticed that the sun had stopped moving entirely, frozen at an angle that shouldn't exist, casting shadows that bent and twisted independent of any light source. And when he checked his watch, the hands were moving backward, erasing time rather than counting it, suggesting that they weren't just trapped in space, but in a temporal loop that would replay their horror forever. Tom managed to climb onto a large boulder, pulling Emma up with him. But the rock began to sink slowly into the creek as if it were quicksand. And beneath the water's surface, he could see a vast network of caves filled with bodies, perfectly preserved, their eyes open and aware, watching the living with a mixture of pity and anticipation, knowing that soon there would be new additions to their underwater congregation, new souls to join the eternal gathering beneath Silent Creek, where time flowed in all directions at once. And escape was just another story the water liked to tell, before revealing that everyone who drinks from its pools, everyone who camps beside its banks, everyone who hears its whispered promises of peace has already been claimed. Their fate written in the sediment long before they ever set foot in these cursed woods. The extra figure by the fire suddenly stood up, water cascading from its form in impossible amounts, far more than any clothing could hold. And as it turned toward them, they saw its face clearly for the first time. Not one face, but dozens superimposed over each other, shifting and changing like a living photograph of every person who had ever drowned in Silent Creek. And when it spoke, its voice was a chorus of gurgling whispers that seemed to come from the water itself rather than any human throat. Jake tried to run, but found his feet had sunk into the ground, the earth around the creek turning to mud that held him like concrete. And as he struggled, he noticed that grass and moss were beginning to grow over his boots with terrifying speed, as if nature itself was claiming him, making him part of the landscape that would trap the next group of unsuspecting hikers. Emma's phone, which had been dead for hours, suddenly lit up with hundreds of messages, all from numbers that didn't exist. containing photos of their group taken from angles that made no sense, showing them sleeping while shadowy figures stood over their tents, dating back weeks before they'd even planned this trip, suggesting that their arrival here had been orchestrated by forces that existed outside normal causality. Sarah felt her memories beginning to blur and fragment, unable to remember if they'd been here for days or decades, if she'd always been standing in this water, or if there had ever been a time before Silent Creek. And when she looked at her hands, she could see through them slightly, as if she was becoming translucent, fading into the morning mist that never seemed to burn off no matter how high the sun climbed. Marcus discovered that their backpacks had transformed into rotting canvas bags filled with belongings from different eras. Old compasses, rusted canteens, leather journals, daguerreotype photographs of people dressed in clothing from the 1800s, all perfectly preserved despite their age. And in each photo, the same creek appeared in the background with the same extra figure waiting by the water. Tom's breathing became labored as he realized the air itself was becoming thicker, more like breathing underwater. And when he coughed, creek water spilled from his lungs, even though he hadn't swallowed any. His body somehow filling with the cursed liquid from the inside out, drowning on dry land while his friends watched helplessly. The figure began walking toward them, its movement creating ripples in the air as if reality was liquid. And with each step, their surroundings shifted between different time periods, showing them the creek through decades of history. Always with groups of campers, always with the same horrible ending. A temporal slideshow of doom that revealed their fate was not unique, but part of an endless pattern that Silent Creek had been weaving since before the first maps were drawn. Emma grabbed Marcus's hand, finding comfort in human contact, even as she felt his pulse slowing to match the lazy rhythm of the creek's flow. And together, they watched as the sun began to set in the wrong direction, moving backward across the sky, reversing through dawn into night, showing them that they were moving backward through time, becoming part of the creek's history rather than its future. And somewhere in the distance, they could hear new voices approaching, happy hikers looking for the perfect camping spot beside the beautiful Silent Creek. The new hikers' laughter echoed through the trees as Emma tried to scream a warning, but no sound emerged, only the gurgling of creek water that now flowed freely from her mouth. And she watched in horror as the cycle began anew. The fresh group setting up their tents in the exact spots where her own had stood, or would stand, or was still standing in some twisted version of time that Silent Creek commanded. The figure that had been watching them slowly dissolved back into the mist, satisfied that its collection was complete, leaving the 6 of them standing in the water that now reached their waists, despite the creek appearing shallow to the newcomers who splashed playfully in what looked like ankle-deep streams, unable to see the drowning souls trapped beneath the surface. Jake felt his consciousness splitting, part of him still fighting to escape while another part accepted his fate. Understanding that Silent Creek didn't just claim bodies, but created echoes of its victims across time, each one becoming the mysterious extra figure for another doomed group. An endless recursion of horror where victim became harbinger in an eternal loop. Sarah's last coherent thought before the water closed over her head was that somewhere, somewhen, another version of herself was just arriving at the creek, excited about the perfect camping spot. And she wondered if that Sarah would notice the extra tent, the additional shadow by the fire, the one too many reflection in the water. But knowing with terrible certainty that she couldn't, because Silent Creek had always been waiting, would always be waiting. Patient as erosion, certain as gravity. And as the darkness took her, she heard her own voice from 3 days ago, laughing about finding such an isolated spot, so far from civilization that no one would ever find them if something went wrong.